Well, thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this fourth webinar in the ISEED series. We are delighted to welcome another member of our advisory board today, after Heather Douglas today, Mark Brown. Let me just say a few words by means of introduction. Mark Brown is professor of political science at California State University in Sacramento. He works on democratic theory and political representation, deliberation, expertise, the politics of science and the environment. These are all really very central themes to our project, to the ISEED project. So we are delighted to have Mark today talking to us. Let me just remind you of his book, which is also extremely interesting for the type of work that we do: Science in Democracy, Expertise, Institutions, and Representation, where he tries not only to rethink the boundaries between science and politics, but also trying to rethink the very concept of representation, right? Trying to diversify, to make it more diverse so that it can include a whole range of social perspectives, the experts, the non-experts, the politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So we are really looking forward, Mark, to being enlightened by you on these themes. So over to you, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks for inviting me to talk for a little bit. I'm going to be talking about the general theme of trust in science, trust and expertise, which is something that is an issue we've dealt with for a very long time with regard to a whole range of topics: climate change, GMOs, evolution, and of course, most recently, the pandemic. And I'm going to try to bring together some themes from democratic theory and research in the politics of science and technology. And I want to talk about three basic topics: trust in democracy, trust in science, and how to promote healthy trust in scientific experts. I'm not going to be using any slides. I hope that's okay. I thought I would do it the old-fashioned way and just talk. I am grateful to be able to speak in my native language of English, and I know that's not true for everybody. So I'll try to go somewhat more slowly and keep it clear. And I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback, and hope we can have a discussion about this topic. It's something that I've in some ways been working on for a long time, but I haven't. I'm just working on some new research in this area. So the key points that I want to make, just to summarize, first of all, that I think it's important to see that historically there's a real difference between trust in science and trust in democratic politics and democratic institutions. Historically, both scientists and politicians have often expected a certain kind of deferential attitude towards science, what you might call blind trust. But in politics, blind trust has long been rejected as naive and unreliable. In democracy, most people think that a skeptical mistrust of those in power is more appropriate. And so as science becomes more politicized in various contexts, we need to shift from the sort of trust that has been expected in science to those kinds of trust that are familiar in more explicitly political areas. So the main point that I want to make is that to promote healthy trust in scientific experts, we need to recognize the important role of democratic distrust. So first, a few definitions. What is trust? Well, there's no single perfect definition. Trust is probably one of those essentially contested concepts that people will never agree on. For a working definition, I found the work of political theorist Mark Warren to be really useful. According to this definition, I trust someone when I believe that they have both the competence and goodwill to protect my interests without continuous oversight. So trusting someone requires either knowing or assuming that they have an incentive and competence to protect your interest. Another point is that trust relationships are really neither good nor bad in themselves. Trust tends to be something that people just assume is good, but in politics, it's often not. It certainly makes sense to trust people when you know that they have the motivation and competence to act in your interest. But in politics, we deal with conflict. And so trust is often not appropriate. Democracies certainly work best with high levels of social trust, everyday trust among people. But democracies also require healthy mistrust of those with power and authority. And here it's useful to distinguish between interpersonal and institutional trust. Interpersonal trust is trust among friends and family, trust based on our direct experience with others. Institutional trust, in contrast, is trust in rules and procedures, and usually only for very specific tasks. And here, incentives and sanctions become important. I trust institutional rules and procedures because I believe that the people I'm trusting have an incentive to follow the rules, and that if they break the rules, they will be punished in some way. Ordinary citizens can really not know very much about distant government officials or expert advisors, and so we generally have limited ability to monitor them, which means that trusting experts often requires a leap in faith. And in some ways, it's hardly more rational than not trusting them. So that's trust. In recent political science literature on this topic, it's people have started distinguishing between different kinds of trust. Trust often gets understood as a dichotomy. Do people trust experts or don't they? Sometimes it's understood as a continuum. How much do people trust experts? But neither approach really takes account of different kinds of trust. And a useful distinction that people have been making the last few years is between trust, mistrust, and distrust. So mistrust is a suspicious attitude, as one scholar puts it. Mistrust is when you are doubtful or skeptical about someone with power and authority. Distrust, in contrast, involves a complete rejection, cynicism, denial. You might think of climate denial. And here it's interesting to note that both trust and distrust involve a settled belief about someone's trustworthiness. People have made up their minds. Mistrust, in contrast, involves an ongoing monitoring and evaluating of the people or institutions in question. So then when it comes to democracy, of course, it's commonly noted that democracy requires some form of trust. If citizens have a high degree of trust in political institutions, they'll be more likely to vote, more likely to participate in politics, more likely to obey laws and feel some sense of political community. But distrust, well, actually, a little more on distrust. Democracy can be harmed by extensive distrust, political cynicism and disengagement. People become alienated. That's the more common insight. On the other hand, though, if people trust politicians or political parties who are not trustworthy, who are not promoting their interests, then that's certainly not good for democracy. And in some cases, distrust is entirely appropriate. I don't trust Donald Trump, for example, and I think that makes good sense. Trusting someone who's not trustworthy would be to be foolish or gullible. With regard to mistrust, democracy in some ways is founded on mistrust. Both liberalism and democracy historically were founded on distrust of religious and political authorities, at least in the modern era. The democratization of social institutions, when we think about democratizing the workplace or the family, that often begins when people recognize that those in authority do not deserve to be trusted. Individual mistrust is often associated with simply being a critical citizen. Citizens mistrust politicians is so that they can monitor them and hold them accountable. And we can also think of certain key democratic institutions, like the separation of powers, checks and balances, and so on. Those are really institutionalized forms of mistrust. So is the critical media, right? These are ways that we institutionalize mistrust of those in powers. So when it comes to trust in democracy, there's kind of a basic dilemma. On the one hand, trusting people makes you vulnerable to the ill will of others. If I trust you, I'm making a judgment that you intend to protect my interests and that you have the will and competence to do so. But as I said before, democracy is fundamentally about conflicts of interest. If we all had the same interests, we would not need democracy in the first place. And since political relationships are almost by definition relations of conflict, they depend on some degree of mistrust. Okay, now what about trust and expertise? Do people trust experts? And if not, why not? Rather than going through all the recent surveys on trust and experts, I just want to make a few points. Science still remains one of the most trusted social institutions in general. There really is no general crisis of trust in experts. But of course, when it comes to specific issues, distrust and mistrust of science is very widely apparent when we talk about climate change or vaccines, GMOs, evolution, and so on. It is important to note, though, given the way the issue's often framed, is that distrust in science is not limited to conservatives. That's something that liberals often suggest. Liberals tend to distrust mainstream science on topics like nuclear power or fracking or the safety of GMO foods. Conservatives tend to distrust mainstream science on climate change, evolution, the supposed health risks of abortion, the value of stem cell research, the efficacy of sex education, and other topics. And of course, most recently, especially in the United States, expert advice on COVID. So what causes distrust of mainstream experts? It's not a basic ignorance or a lack of science literacy. I think the research is pretty clear on this. People basically trust scientists because they see those scientists and their expert claims as supporting their basic values, interests, or identities. And they distrust scientists for the same reason. Everyone engage in what scholars call motivated reasoning. We accept or reject evidence based on how well it fits with our basic values and worldview. So liberals trust mainstream science on climate change, not because they are more rational than conservatives, but because the science and the policies it supports seems to support their values, interests, and identities. And so the basic reasons on both sides of the political spectrum are more or less the same. I trust mainstream science on climate, not because I've investigated all the studies or done a careful analysis of all the evidence, but because my friends and family do, and because it fits with our basic values and worldview. So in this sense, well, okay, I'll leave it at that. So then is the question, is distrust or mistrust of mainstream science a bad thing? And I want to make the point that no, not always. Trust in science is not generally the major obstacle to having just and effective policy on these issues. If you look at the debate on climate change in the US, for example, it often focuses on the lack of trust in mainstream climate science. But I would say that Democrats in the US are actually lucky that they can blame Republicans and the fossil fuel industry for undermining trust in science, because otherwise Democrats would actually have to do something about the issue. Democrats and Republicans are worlds apart on climate science, but when it comes to policy, Democrats, until very recently, have really not done hardly anything at all. And the fact that Democrats in the US trust science has really done nothing to lead to policies that help to stop climate change. Beyond that, mistrust in science is often justified. Science has provided enormous benefits to science, to society. I'm certainly not anti-science, but science has also caused enormous harm, especially for racialized minorities and other disadvantaged groups. In the US, medical scientists long claimed that Black people were less susceptible to infectious diseases. Black people and other racialized minorities have often been excluded from adequate medical care. They've been used as experimental subjects without informed consent. To quote a recent study from the US CDC, in the United States today, Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. There's a long history of eugenics in Western nations. There is evidence of close ties between science and industry. So there's all kinds of reasons why some people, especially people from disadvantaged groups, would have a justified distrust or mistrust in science. And in fact, as we saw in the pandemic in the US, initially, trust in expert advice was much lower among African Americans than among other groups. that changed over time, and African Americans eventually became actually more likely to seek out vaccines for COVID than other groups. But there was an initial and very understandable distrust of expert advice. So another implication of this is that the appeals we often hear to trust the science or follow the science are often very misleading. In fact, they've often been used to conceal or avoid either unscientific uncertainties or controversies over values. With the pandemic, we had major changes in science advice during the course of the pandemic. Early advice about hand washing and masking and isolation outdoors was changed radically. And I would say overall, at least in the US, there was often a lack of transparency about these uncertainties and about the way that knowledge would change. And there was also often a tendency to paper over or conceal value conflicts in the name of following the science. So on the topic of school closures, for example, there were legitimate differences of opinion, and indeed we saw radically different policies on school closures around the world and also in the US in different regions. And there really was no single best way to follow the science on that issue, even though people often talked as though there were. So the upshot is basically that we don't just need to follow the science, we need to find ways to have healthy trust and healthy mistrust in scientific experts. Okay, so how do we get there? This starts to get into policy advice, which is not my main area, but I have a few general ideas. The main proposal I want to make is that the way to promote healthy trust in science is to institutionalize mistrust. Then there's a certain paradox here, that the best way to promote healthy trust is to institutionalize healthy forms of mistrust. But the idea is that people will be more likely to trust experts if they have ways to reassure themselves that experts will really have their best interest in view. So many science advisory bodies have already been doing this for a while. Measures to improve the transparency and accountability of science advisory bodies that essentially allows people to make use of their mistrust. Deliberative forums on controversial issues have a similar function. They allow people to discuss their mistrust about expert advice. There's been work to build partnerships with local communities to try to make science advice more targeted, especially toward historically marginalized groups. A recent study at University of Michigan in the US by the Center for Science and Technology Policy went through a whole series of measures in this area with a lot of really useful suggestions and kind of documenting what's already being done. Also, simply a recognition that existing knowledge is often highly uncertain. In the US, Anthony Fauci, he recently gave a talk where he admitted that in the early phase of the pandemic, he said we should have said we don't know about whether people should wear masks. Instead, there was a flip-flop. First, the government said don't wear masks, and then it was changed to wearing masks. And it would have been more open and transparent, he said, to just have said from the beginning, we don't know yet. So that's one set of proposals. More generally, you might think of this as avoiding the so-called linear model of science advice. Avoid suggesting that policy recommendations follow directly from science. Be open about the role of political values and the need for trade-offs among competing values. Another set of proposals involves science literacy, and especially forms of promoting science literacy that focus on the scientific process as opposed to substantive scientific knowledge. If people have a better understanding for how science works, that science is a social process, that it is constantly evolving, that it often involves irresolvable uncertainties, especially in policy relevant areas, with that sort of science literacy, people will be more likely to have a healthy form of mistrust and be able to reassure themselves about when it makes sense to follow expert advice. And then perhaps another set of broader policy proposals involves what people call the science communication environment. In the US especially, perhaps the biggest obstacle to effective use of expertise is political polarization. Donald Trump and the Trump administration very intentionally polarized and politicized the pandemic. They turned attitudes about COVID into a test of political identity. And I would say, rather than any kind of general distrust or mistrust of science, that polarization was a major factor in disparities between liberals and conservatives on wearing masks or getting vaccinated. So political polarization creates a science communication environment that makes effective use of expertise extremely difficult. Another aspect of the science communication environment is questions about diversity in science. Not just diversity in terms of race or ethnicity, but also in terms of political attitudes. That most scientists tend to lean to the left. Having more conservative science communicators has been shown to be effective in encouraging trust. Another set of proposals involves the relationship between the natural sciences and the humanities and social sciences. For decades, social scientists have been saying, listen to the natural scientists. I would say that it's time for the natural scientists to start telling people to listen to us. At many universities, the humanities in particular are facing extinction, enormous budget cuts, declining enrollment. And instead of ruthlessly competing for resources, I would say the natural scientists need to help explain to university administrators and government policymakers why the social sciences and humanities deserve more support. And here's the talking point. Without the natural sciences, we cannot understand nature. But without the social sciences and humanities, we cannot understand or make good use of the natural sciences. So, and then finally, I think part of the science communication environment is the legacy of slavery and colonialism. The deep source of mistrust in scientific experts often has to do with a failure to really come to terms with that past. And this is something that's really been on the political agenda for decades, but perhaps getting more attention the last few years. We're seeing widespread advocacy for reparations efforts around the world. Where I am here in California, major legislation was passed a couple of years ago to establish a task force to study reparations to African-American descendants of slavery. And that might seem pretty distant from the world of science and expertise, but if we really look at the sources of distrust in science, I think there's an important connection there. And the scientific community is not an outsider on this issue. If scientists want to take credit for the achievements of science, as we all should, scientists also need to take responsibility for the legacy of scientists' involvement with scientific racism and other forms of abuse. So, and I think at a really broad level, that's another way to promote a healthy trust in science. So I'm going to wrap it up there. At the most general level, I think we should see a lack of trust in science, not initially as a threat to the authority of scientific experts, but rather as an opportunity to demonstrate it in new and more persuasive ways. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to some discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Gosh, there are lots and lots hands raised and, clapping, etc., etc. So let me just start perhaps with the first question, really a question of clarification, and then I'll let my colleagues to kick in. You said about healthy trust and mistrust, which is kind of core of your argument, and you said that a form of healthy trust entails finding a way to convince the public or citizens the scientists have their best interest in view. Where would that leave politicians? And I mean, are citizens entitled to instead unhealthily distrust politicians? And is it not a little bit of a dangerous position to take? Because, you know, the more distant the citizens are from, you know, the way politics is actually performed, you know, the more the politicians are let, you know, to their own devices, and then, you know, they don't have any form of control. And then ultimately, who makes the decisions is not the scientists, it's the politicians. So how do you see the interaction between scientists and politicians vis-a-vis, you know, trust, the kind of trust the citizens actually should put on either, or both, ideally on both, I would say. I don't know whether I sort of disagree.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, it sounds like you're asking about how does the relation between scientific advisors and politicians, how does that affect trust relationships? Is that part of it?
Yeah, it's part of it, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly in a democracy, if people feel that or perceive that that politicians are trying to rely too directly on scientific advice, I think that can often be a cause of distrust, right? If politicians are obscuring or concealing value conflicts, value trade-offs, and saying follow the science, that by itself is a red flag for a lot of people. And I would say that's a healthy impulse. That's a healthy anti-technocratic impulse to distrust people who are trying to tell you to simply follow the science. At least in issue areas where there are obvious conflicts of interest and value conflicts, right? I mean, the idea that you could follow the science on school closures is preposterous. There was no scientific consensus on that issue, right? With regard to the pandemic, there still isn't, right? And so I think by avoiding that sort of technocratic, decisionistic relationship, right, which are two different approaches, but both assert a linear relation between science and politics. By avoiding that, I think it's easier to, you know, avoid sort of a strong distrust in both experts and politicians. I'm not. Yeah, is that part of your?
Yeah, it is. It's
part of what you were getting at. Yeah.
Heather, you want to?
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your talk. I really like the trust, distrust, and mistrust. To put that in there, that's really helpful. And I'm going to ask you to send me where I can read about that so I can cite that, especially if it's your work. But what I wanted to ask you about institutionalizing mistrust is how you think that might be able to be done for science funding. I mean, there's lots of public dollars that go to science, and how might we institutionalize healthy mistrust in our science funding systems?
Well, that's a big question that I don't know much about.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, you know, certainly efforts to make those decisions more transparent, to establish institutions for public oversight and critique, which there already are to some extent. You know, but ordinary citizens don't have time to pay attention to all this, and so that's why we rely on various advocacy groups, interest groups, you know, and there are groups that advocate for funding on various issues, patient advocacy groups, right? You might think of patient advocacy groups as a form, you know, and mechanisms for involving them as a form of institutionalized mistrust, right? That we've said that we're not going to let policymakers decide this all by themselves. We're going to provide avenues for interest groups to get involved because we know that not everyone trusts us, and nor should they, right? Because of all the areas of science that have been neglected, right? I mean, as we know, scientists don't simply choose their topics out of sheer curiosity, right? There's politics involved in how research topics are selected and determined, and often major areas have been neglected for decades. So yeah, I would say it's not just about an attitude of mistrust. It's about establishing institutions that provide, you know, regular opportunities, not just for ordinary folks, but for established interest groups to have a role in the science funding process.
Thanks.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Stephanie?
Okay, says, hello, Mark. Thank you for your talk.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice
Okay,
to see you again.
So you said, and rightly so, that scientists should be able to say, we don't know yet. But of course, scientific discourse is in competition with other kind of discourses when it comes to be the basis of political action. So while scientists say we don't know yet, what's happening? I mean, on which other kind of discourses political actions will be based? Because it's not like there won't be any political actions. So what is the gain in terms of trust in science in general? To just say we don't know yet, so make your decision on other grounds. How do you deal with the situation when you have to make a decision? And if you say we don't know yet, what's going on? What happens?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the gain for politicians is often not a gain at all. That's why they don't like to do it. It means they have to take responsibility for their decisions. They have to say, you know, I'm deciding this. And politicians often, if the decision is unpopular, they're afraid of being punished in the next election or otherwise. But on the other hand, it can also be an opportunity for politicians to show leadership and decisiveness, to say the experts are uncertain, the experts are divided, and so I'm going to take a decision, right? I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to take leadership. I'm going to do what I was elected to do. Alexander Bogner has written about this for a long time, the idea that expert dissent provides opportunities for a revival of politics, that expert dissent, if it's not covered over, it can be actually used to kind of reestablish the authority of political leaders, because they can say, I or we are making this decision, and we're going to, stand for it and allow ourselves to be held accountable for it. In some cases, politicians want to do that. I mean, you do see politicians saying, for example, I'm not going to listen to the experts, and we tend to see that as a negative thing. And of course, if politicians aren't listening at all to experts, that is a negative thing. Certainly, politicians should always take expert advice into account. But when there's no clear and decisive policy coming from expert advice, then politicians can use that as an opportunity to assert their leadership. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you were getting at? Yeah.
Right. I see George, Gaskell, and Sophia. Can I just ask you something very quickly? Should politicians only listen to scientists? I mean, are they the only experts? Because this is also an important question to raise. I mean, there are different types of experts. I mean, I would say a moral philosopher is an expert. And when you said before, you know, politicians should, or scientists should listen more to people in the humanities, I think you were going in that direction a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I've been focusing on natural scientific experts just because that's what everyone else focuses on. But maybe I'm reproducing a problem. Yes, and I do think that in the pandemic, for example, if you look at who was on the advisory committees, it was dominated by epidemiologists and other natural scientific experts. Maybe they brought in a couple economists here and there, but there were very few, right, philosophers or political scientists or anthropologists. Maybe people started to bring in you know, cultural anthropologists when they realized that they had to make more targeted advice, right? There were various outreach efforts to specific communities, and that did involve sometimes a certain social science expertise, right? Who do we need to talk to? Where are they? In California, there were really excellent outreach efforts to farm worker communities, for example, and that certainly involved social scientific expertise. But overall, there was a terrible exclusion of social scientists and humanities scholars from expert advice on the pandemic.
True. Okay, so George Gaskell. George, London School of Economics. Yeah. You're muted. You're muted.
I've come back to life. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I want to consider these two lots of people on trust. We've got the mistrusters and the distrusters. Now, the distrusters, if we look at the anti-vaxxers, become a social movement. But the mistrusters don't. They act as individuals, I would contend. So I think one of the challenges is, would it be the case that things like transparency, accountability, and expressing the uncertainties around scientific knowledge, are they going to persuade the distrusters to leave the social movement? Or is the social movement in a way an epiphenomenon, or is vaccination an epiphenomenon for a social movement that, you know, captures its own momentum?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with the second option. You know, and it depends on the point, the kind of timeline, the historical point at which you're talking about on a particular issue. I think very early in the pandemic in the US, there was an opportunity perhaps to avoid politicizing the issue. And that opportunity was rejected by the Trump administration. But I think once an issue becomes politicized, then it's almost impossible to reach the people in the distrust category. And in a way, studying and talking about trust in science is almost beside the point. We're looking at the symptom and not the cause, right? The cause is political polarization, and people have come to see expert advice in a particular area as fundamentally in conflict with their identity, right? There's been some interesting research showing how, I mean, Republicans in the US just associate expert advice on the pandemic and also on climate change as in conflict with their basic personal and political identity. And once you're at that point, it's pretty difficult to do much, I think. So they're the issue that we have to focus on is political polarization as the real cause of fundamental distrust in science or in political institutions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right. I can see Sophia Evstatu, Norwegian University of Science and Technology. I'm just giving you the kind of geographical.
Thank you, Leonora, for the brief intro, and thank you, Mark, for your talk. So nice to have you with us, and ISEED.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah, I was thinking about many things while you were talking, so I just gonna share. First of all, I was wondering like how you relate to work within feminist technoscience and epistemology, and the ideas like successor science, or including, you know, voices from the margins and interests around the margins in science, and later work within responsible research and innovation more recently, talking about values like inclusion and responsiveness to public concerns. So basically one thing I was wondering is, like, are you talking about distrust, mistrust, etc. in science, or in a particular kind of science that's, you know, not responsible enough, not inclusive enough, etc.? And is it then distrust or mistrust that you're interested in, or is it, you know, making science more inclusive, making the science better, you know, in some ways, morally and procedurally? So that's what I was wondering about, because I've heard you say both things today, and I'm wondering if actually what you are interested in is a better science, kind of, or a better process for science. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, those specific areas you mentioned, I'm not familiar with all of those. I certainly would agree that more diverse science tends to be epistemically better. You know, in part dependent on the area. But that's not my main area of interest. I mean, I'm more interested in experts in politics, as opposed to the quality of science itself. So in that area, there's similar, you know, research showing that more diverse advisory committees tend to produce better advice, but also tend to be more trusted, especially if they're giving advice for a diverse society. It makes sense that a more diverse body will, you know, evoke more trust, other things being equal. In terms of gender and trust, I just was reading a recent article looking at empirically at how gender affects not so much the level of trust, but what people mean by trust and distrust. And in this study, people who identify as male or female actually associated different qualities with these different terms. I can't remember off the top of my head what the specific differences were, but I think there's definitely a dimension there where you know, gender affects what it means to trust or mistrust somebody, and you know, that's something I want to look into more. But that's about all I can say on that for now. It's an important set of issues. Thank you.
Okay, Pierluigi Barrotta, University of Pisa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talks. It's very fascinating. Just a question. Honestly, well, I'm not a native English speaker, so I honestly thought that mistrust and distrust had the same meaning. But your distinction is very, very clear and clear-cut. Mistrust is a sort of organized skepticism, to use Robert Merton typology. What puzzles me is that I see today a lot of distrust in science, a lot of trust in science, and very little mistrust in science. And this is not surprising, because if we understand mistrust as a sort of organized skepticism, this would require a lot of very demanding skills on the part of the citizen. So what I'm trying to understand, why you think this category, mistrust, is useful from a political point of view.
Yeah, I agree. It can be demanding, and in that sense, it's part of a general category of critical citizenship that is both important and difficult to promote. But it can be somewhat more possible if we remember that we don't need mistrust with regard to all institutions, and certainly not with regard to all expert claims, right? Mistrust has to be very targeted. And we need to be able to have trust most of the time. We need to economize on our mistrust, right? And only really develop it in areas where there are serious conflicts of interest and conflicts of values, right? Like, say, on school closures during the pandemic, right? I mean, it was obvious early on that there was a conflict of values and interest, right? What's more important, to educate children or to protect people from getting infected? How do we, involve, parents from different socioeconomic groups, parents who need to have their kids in school so they can go to work, versus parents who can work from home, right? There are real social and ideological and economic conflicts, so that's an area where mistrust is appropriate and needed. But I would say on climate science, on the basic notion that humans are changing the climate, mistrust would be a waste of time, right? The time for that is over. I maybe had a little mistrust 20 years ago, but not anymore. I have better things to do. So I think by economizing, we can make it a little bit more realistic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Paolo Bodini, former ISEED member, but here present, philosopher of law, University of Genova. Yeah, Paolo.
Yeah, thank you, Leonore, and thank you so much, Mark, for your interesting talk. I was curious about your proposal, so to institutionalize the mistrust to ensure trust, to speak. And so I'm very sympathetic with your view. I think there are similar positions in the literature, but at the same time, I think this kind of approach could lead us a bit too far. So I give you an example in the field of law. So I think that the Supreme Court in the US is an example of an institution which is entitled to read law, to interpret the law, and in this sense, it is an example of institutionalization of mistrust. So mistrust in this case about our disagreement about the meaning of the law. But every institution has a political nature. So in this sense, I see in your proposal this risk, the risk that our strong disagreement, and here the problem of polarizations comes back again, could discredit the institution itself. So I was just curious to know something more about your ideas about this problem.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important issue. I mean, in some of my work, I've tried to distinguish between calling something political and calling it a site of politics. So I would say, of course, the Supreme Court is political, but it should not be a site of politics in the sense of, open competition for resources or power. And you might say the same about science advisory bodies. Obviously, they're political, they're shaped by politics, they have political implications and effects. But for them to be trusted, they have to avoid becoming sites of politics, of political competition, and so I'm not sure if that gets to your question, but I find it, and I haven't really thought about applying that to the question of trust. But it seems to me that when we're talking about politics, we're talking about conflicts of interest and values, and so mistrust is usually appropriate. But not all. But if we had politics everywhere, if we had no escape from politics, we would live in a totalitarian society, right? That's one definition of totalitarianism, is a society where politics is pervasive, where everything, your public life, your private life, every institution is pervaded by politics. So that's not democratic either. So I don't know. That's how I would start thinking about it. Does that get a little bit of what you're thinking about?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Further questions? Again, the people who are doing empirical research, I kind of push them to.
Niccolò.
Is that Niccolò? Yes, Niccolò. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if Luigi had the hand up. Thank you, Mark, for this great discussion. I wanted to ask you a comment on the role of opposition politicians, because especially when you were mentioning just a few minutes ago in the questions and answers, the idea that once an issue becomes politicized, it becomes impossible to reach the distrusting ones, and it seemed like it seems like that there is a widespread awareness that this happens and has happened, for instance, in the pandemic. And so I was wondering what can be done in order for this kind of political strategy not to fall into a party who's got a lot to gain from this kind of separation. What I'm thinking about was the way in which polarization can be also engineered by opposition politicians as a convenient way to corner a government who might be handling a crisis. Obviously, no government wants to handle a crisis of any sort, because you can only get it wrong, but it depends on how in so many ways. So in that sense, I don't know if this applies to US politics, but I thought, it's sometimes it feels a little bit convenient for people on my side of the debate to think that the Trumpers are all redneck and impulsive identitarians. And for sure, there is, I think, some kind of agency in opposition arguments that can actually corner these people into an identity argument, such that then it becomes an identity argument. And so, yeah, I was wondering if there is any commentary, is like, are we opening a little bit of a Pandora's box here? And look, or otherwise, is the genie out of the lamp at this point? Because once the opposition politicians realize that everything that has got to scientific expertise can become a polarizing argument, it's a bit chaotic.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to put it. I think politicization is it's easy to start and hard to stop. I think that's right. I mean, we can look at areas where there has been depoliticization, and I think that does happen, where an issue is hotly contested, and then there's a social process, and then there's some sort of resolution. You look at the history of abortion politics in some countries. In Germany, for example, abortion politics has been mostly depoliticized. In the US, it has not. And I'm not sure if that's the best example, but you can certainly see how some areas become depoliticized because people either accept a compromise, or because people give up, or for whatever reason. They might be unjustly depoliticized, but sometimes it might be because a just resolution has emerged. And so I think that's one way to go in thinking about how to depoliticize issues. But you're right. I mean, under current conditions, it's always very easy to take that route in challenging experts. I think in some ways, in the US at least, it's often been conservatives who have been more attuned to the power dimensions of science, right? With regard to climate change, you know, I remember Al Gore saying climate change is not a political issue, it's a human issue. Or Greta Thunberg, whereas, you know, on her trip across the ocean, she had follow the science on her sail, on her sailboat, right? As though, you know, this weren't a matter of conflicts of interest. I mean, she's obviously said other things where she does identify conflicts of interest, but it often is liberals who try to claim that these issues are not political, and conservatives point out, well, wait a second, you're talking about major government programs, right? You're talking about transforming our economy. Of course, that's political. So, but yeah, it's a difficult set of issues. I'm not sure what else to say. Did you have something else to add to that?
No, I'm afraid that I don't. I feel a little bit like yeah, it's not my angle, but it made me wonder a little bit, like in what ways we should think about the wider political environment. In that sense, I was thinking about opposition politicians as some people who have a role in framing issues. As you know, besides obviously the kind of dichotomy between government policymaker and scientists.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could add that, you know, if politicians are more open about the conflicts of values and interests when it comes to science-related issues, they'll be less vulnerable to politicization, right? To be less vulnerable to being accused of ignoring or hiding those conflicts. It's better to put them out up front.
Thank you. Can I ask another question if there are no other questions?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
It's a completely different question, but in the last point you made in the talk, you were talking about the need for science to reconnect or recognize more constructively the legacy of slavery and colonialism, and I was wondering what would be the suitable means to do so. What kind of processes or institutions, you know, should be instituted or enabled to do so in a genuine fashion.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't looked at this in great detail with regard to science. I know the American Association for the Advancement of Science has some initiatives in this area. I think especially of museums. I've been to a lot of museums the last few years that are really looking into the history of stolen artifacts from former colonies, and have really taken amazing steps to contextualize their artifacts, and to really show, not necessarily to give them back, although that's happening also, but to display them in context, sometimes alongside more recent artworks from people from those former colonies, and to really you know, make people aware of this history in a way that I think is often very constructive and gets people to think you know, about the history and its current continuing effects. I mean, that's what comes to mind at the moment. It's something I haven't really delved into.
Thank you.
I don't see any hands raised for the timing. Maybe I can ask you a couple of things while other people gather their thoughts. You mentioned science literacy, and I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, you know, it has been demonstrated abundantly that, you know, lack of science literacy doesn't translate immediately into lack of trust, and vice versa. But how would you see, you know, a kind of healthy science literacy? I mean, a kind of science literacy that can actually help to build not only trust, but a healthy type of mistrust. I mean, in such a way that citizens can actually take part in the public debate and have positions to share, or you know, form opinions about what they are discussing, etc., etc. So that's the first question. And the second question, I mean, again, I would ask for your vision about how you would relate trust and representation. I mean, how would this, I mean, this is a very wide question, but how would you see these two concepts relate with each other, especially because you have this view of representation as being a very diversified notion and an inclusive notion, to go in Sophia's direction. So these are the two curiosity that I have at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, with regard to science literacy, there have been efforts to try and bring the insights from the field of science and technology studies and sociology of science, to bring that into science education programs, so that, I mean, like I said, to focus on the process of science, but more broadly to focus on the history and politics of science, and how science is a social institution that often involves conflicts of interest, that has, you know, both done, you know, had both good and bad effects on society, right? To just have a more social and more historical perspective in our science literacy programs. You know, and I think that would give people the tools to think more critically about science, and thereby, in the end, to have more trust in scientific experts, if they feel like they're getting the whole story and not just a sanitized version of the story. It's not, again, not something that I've looked at in detail, but if you look in, you know, the literature on science pedagogy, there definitely are efforts in that area. In terms of representation, I mean, yeah, that's something we could talk about for a long time. I mean, as you mentioned in your introduction, certainly one idea I've worked with is the idea of representing social perspectives, that when we're talking about diversity in political and scientific institutions, I think the best argument for including a wider range of perspectives is to avoid saying that members of different groups represent the interest of those groups, right? That, you know, having more women or more people of color in a science advisory bodies doesn't necessarily mean that the interest of those groups are going to be represented. But it does mean that questions and concerns are more likely to be raised that come out of the experience of members of those groups, right? I mean, you know, we obviously wouldn't want a science advisory body on abortion to be only men. But it's important to think about exactly why that is, right? And it's not because all men have the same interest or because all women have the same interest. It's because in a society shaped by gender, people who identify as men or women tend to have different experiences, and those experiences provide epistemic resources for raising questions and concerns. They're essentially deliberative resources, right? So I think of diversity as a contribution to deliberation rather than to interest representation, because it enriches the conversation to have more diverse perspectives. So, and then also, because people's assessments and trust relationships are shaped by their social identities, it can also increase trust, right? That you have to trust, as I said, when you trust someone, you are assuming not only that they have the competence to represent your interest, but also that they have the will to do so. And assessments of whether someone, you know, has my best interest in mind, that in a racialized and, you know, society with a history of group-based oppression, those assessments are inevitably going to be shaped by people's social identities. Not determined, but definitely shaped and influenced. And so that means there's a good case for increasing trust by increasing social diversity.
But clearly has also something to do with educating people to sort of not just relate to their own interest, but, you know, making room for interests of other people and, you know, so diversified interest. Because if you ask the average citizen, if assuming that there is such a thing, whether he or she trusts more somebody who sort of support his or her interest or somebody who supports a wide range of interests, I mean, the answer would be, well, of course, I more directly empathize with somebody who sort of support my own interests. But this goes down to lack of education, I think, or again, lack of awareness that, you know, your interest might be well served if also, and even more so in the context of, you know, in a balanced context of other interests. I mean, I don't know whether you sort of agree with this.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that gets to the question of what people mean by interest in the first place, right? We tend to use the interest as though it were only a matter of the narrow self-interest of individuals.
Yes.
But, you know, I would say historically, most identity-based advocacy groups have actually promoted not only their group interest, but also the public interest, right? That, you know, women's groups in the 70s did not only try to promote the interests of women, they thought that by doing so, they were promoting the interests of the entire society. And the same goes for other you know, identity-based groups. Sometimes, I mean, when we talk about identity politics, you know, people often focus on kind of narrow sectarian groups, and there certainly are those narrow groups that are only focused on their narrow group interest, but I think historically that has not usually been the case, and there's really no necessary conflict. In fact, there's a real compatibility between promoting the interests of disadvantaged groups and promoting the interests of the entire society. And I think if we made that connection more explicit and more public, there'd be a better case or more acceptance for the diversifying, you know, the various bodies that we're talking about.
Yeah, true. George, I can see your hand raised again.
Yeah, so Mark, you distinguished between the political system and the scientific system. Politics riven with conflict or based on conflict, and science, well, at best, organized skepticism. Now, throughout the pandemic in the UK, we had press conferences where there was always a senior politician and one or two senior scientists. Do you think that's a dangerous way, bringing the two different systems together, the logics of those systems being quite different? Might that have been at the expense of trust in science?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there'd be a good case for, you know, doing more to put the politicians up front.
Yes, that's what I think.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just so tempting to push responsibility onto the scientists. Machiavelli wrote about this. I mentioned this in my book in the chapter on Machiavelli. He advised. He said that when the prince selects advisors, he should his advice to advisors was to avoid getting too close to the prince, because otherwise they'd be blamed afterwards when things go wrong. And you know, if we really want to put accountability where it should be, then it's the political decision makers who should be up front.
I mean, the problem in the UK, if I may just comment on that, is the Prime Minister at the time apparently did not study science. since the age of 13 and had difficulty understanding a graph. So it's a rather strange idea that, you know, we have confidence. Who would have confidence in politicians whose background almost excludes anything scientific?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, politicians should also make clear that they've consulted with scientists and that they're taking the best available advice. Absolutely.
If they don't understand that advice, though, we are in rather troubled waters.
That is true. Although I don't think you need to know how to do science to talk to scientists.
No,
right?
true.
Or to understand their advice. There's I mean, Harry Collins has the concept of what is it? I'm forgetting the idea, but basically the idea that you don't have to be able to contribute to science.
Interactional expertise.
Exactly. Thank you. You don't have to be able to contribute to science to have an intelligent and critical discussion with scientists. Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we leave it there?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, we've been abusing of your time, you know, given that it's so early for you. You need you know, some caffeine maybe.
Oh no, I have lots of caffeine. No, thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for discussing these issues. That are really important for us and for our project, and they are important, generally speaking. So it's been a pleasure having you here, and thank you everybody for your questions. And we will have another webinar in how many days, Chiara?
Next week.
Next week. Okay. Another advisory board member will talk about her project. Okay. Well,
thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
thank you.
Let me I hope I get to meet some of you in person sometime, and thank you very much